Right, so most intermediate guitarists have probably come across this pattern before. So I'm playing in the key of A minor, not very in tune. And then they know that if they play it at the 12th position, then they're in E minor. Now, you may or may not know that's the pentatonic scale. You may have come across this thing where actually there's these other patterns. I mean, it's the same notes reappearing, and obviously the further up the neck you go, then you get some more high notes. You go that way, it opens up some lower notes to you. I find that having taught for a while, most people don't really bother to learn these. You know, if they improvise, then they tend to do it around that pattern and not know the rest of the neck, and you're kind of really limiting yourself there. You're slowing down how quickly you can learn new things, and you know, you just can't connect things together when you're improvising so well. What I want to point out, to give you more of an incentive to learn that stuff, is they're actually incredibly similar to each other. Pentatonic, the semantic root of that is, well, I don't know, something in Latin, but basically pent is something which kind of means 5, same way that the pentagon's got 5 walls and the pentangle's got 5 points. So really it's the same notes over and over again. It's do, re, fa, sol, si, do. I'm using the solfege. That's root note, minor 3rd, perfect 5th, minor 7th, and then back to root note. And I mean, all these patterns contain that. It's the same notes reappearing on a different part of the neck. The point that I'm trying to get to here is that because those notes are evenly spaced and the strings in the guitar are kind of evenly spaced, then the patterns are predictable and repeat themselves. And actually you can break the scale down into 2 shapes. We've got a square. I'll put some diagrams up in this channel later, but if you imagine there's a dot there, there. So it's kind of a square shape, like it's 3 by 3, so if that was centimeters, that would be a square. And then you've got a rectangle, because it's 4 frets by 2 strings, so if something was 4 by 2 centimeters, it would be a rectangle, okay? So there's a square, there's a square. This is a square. You have to go across the way like this, because these 2 strings are tuned together closer. So there's like, later on I'll put up a video and explain what I mean by the gap. That's not a musical term, it's just what I call it. But it's almost like there's something in between the B and the G string, the 2nd and the 3rd string in standard tuning, which distorts these patterns. For me, what I do is I kind of imagine there's loads of diagonal joining those 2 strings like that, so that I know if I've got a scale pattern like this square, where just be normal, if I cross the gap, I go diagonally that way, and when I descend, I go diagonally back. Right, anyway, so these squares appear all over the place, you know, and at certain points, if I had a 7th string, it goes, right, and you're not be so far, but an octave lower than that. So, what am I doing? So there's loads of them kind of joined together, going across like that. That's a square. Across the gap, that's a square. And if I had a 0th string, like a thinner string here, then that would be the top of a square there. So that pattern reappears all over the place. The other kind of pattern is a rectangle. That one's over the gap, so the whole thing's kind of at a diagonal. And then we're back. Sorry, whoops, wrong key. That's just that 12 frets up. So, I mean, I won't try and play anything like really snazzy. I'll just kind of go around these scales. But I'm in a square, I'm in a rectangle, I'm in a square, I'm in a rectangle, square. That's like a bit of a rectangle where it's cut off. If I had a 7th string, I'll have a complete rectangle there. That's like the top row of a square on its own. Rectangle. rectangle, square. That's the bottom row of a square on its own. If I had two thinner strings here, I'd have a complete square there. Rectangle, square, rectangle. That's a square there. Rectangle, and then that's a square. It's the bottom two rows of it. And then here's a rectangle, here's a square, here's a rectangle, square. Now, the reason I'm saying square and rectangle at you a bunch of times is that if you learn a lick, I'm going to use Layla because it fits really nicely into that rectangle. Your muscle memory is going to be exactly the same if you try and reproduce the same melody in another rectangle. So there's another rectangle here, so I can go, and then there's another rectangle here. Make a slight adaptation there because I'm crossing the gap. There's a rectangle here, so I can go, and then there's another rectangle here. And the way this breaks down is you've really got two ways of playing any melody. Like you start that side of your hand, you start that side of your hand, and you're going to end up playing a square or a rectangle. So I mean, the other way to play Layla within a square instead is, and that's going to work if I've got a square here, and if I've got a square here. See that top row there? I'm putting finger 2 there because I'm crossing the gap, I would say. So I've got this thing where, I was talking about those diagonal lines. I go across like that. So whoops. Do that again. So, I'll try and do something slightly more fancy. Apologies for, mainly the tuning there. But I was just basically kind of going, up this bit and down this one, up this one, down this one, this one. Once you know where that stuff is thoroughly, then I'll try and go across the fretboard less like that this time. So. Not very inspiring, but hopefully you can see there are points where I was just going straight that way, and the reason I kind of know where the intervals are is because I know those patterns really thoroughly, and I find knowing those patterns really thoroughly really easy because it's just a square and a rectangle. That's probably not going to have made a huge amount of sense to you if you really are a complete beginner at the guitar. I guess this is actually me trying out Camtasia 6. First time I've used it, and I'm just kind of going for this in one take and see what happens. I'm hoping that maybe if you played for a couple of years, there's little things you recognise. When I'm using the square, I'm going finger 1 3 1 3 1 3, and you're like, oh yeah, all these kind of licks. That should recognise that feeling. Well, you can put that all over the neck. You can export that fingering that you've learnt in one place of the neck, and there'll be basically as many as 5 places. This corresponds to the cage system, incidentally. I'll explain that connection more thoroughly at some future point. For you intermediate or advanced players, and hopefully that's kind of, maybe it's told you stuff you already knew, but hopefully it's given you some kind of insight into a simple way to understand the whole fretboard. the way this continues, by the way, is that you may or may not know that, for instance, Aeolian, Phrygian, and Dorian, which are 3 kinds of 7-note per octave scales, all contain all the notes of the pentatonic. So that way of understanding the fretboard gives you a very simple framework where you only really need to add 2 extra notes per octave and you're playing modes. So don't really know what else to say about that. I think I'll stop now. Cheery bye.